He's a senior fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the study of religious and ethnic diversity. He has been a genuine alumni. I mean, he was a student here a long time ago, right? If I'm correct. And he has co-authored 2 books. In fact, the first book was Islamism and Democracy in India, and the recent one is about the warfare welfare, the algebra of warfare welfare. This is the story of the 2014 India election, and today he is actually talking about this topic, Indian democracy and the algebra of warfare welfare, an anthropological outline. And he has been writing on issues related to religion, ethnicity, and diversity from a political anthropology perspective. And he has been actively working on the editorial team of Public Anthropologist, the journal, and also religious and political practices. Today, as I mentioned already, the topic is on this very interesting coinage, the warfare and welfare related to Indian democracy. And I welcome Dr. Irfan Ahmad. It's all yours.
Thank you, Ratish, for introduction, and I want to thank Tanveer Fazal for the invitation and making this talk possible. Can you hear me or? Okay. So, it is always good to be back to the center where where I got my degree in Masters and MPhil, so I'm very pleased to be here. Now, what I'm going to do here is first, as you can see, I will begin with the main thesis that I want to present here in this talk, and I think I'm going to do a little bit of advertising here. So, this talk is based on this book, which was released 2 days ago officially in a symposium at India National Center. So maybe you can pass it around and people can have a look at it. So I will begin with the argument, and then the talk is structured into 2 main sections. In the first section, I will present a critique of the received wisdom about Indian politics, and from that critique I move to the next section, which basically outlines and explicates the main contention that I put forward here, and in the end I will have a brief conclusion. So here it goes. In 2014, political scientist James Alexander published Note Towards a Definition of Politics, where he examined the definition in the thoughts of Hannah Arendt, Michael Oakeshott, R.J. Collingwood, Carl Schmitt, and Jacques Rancière. What drove Alexander to write a definition of politics was the disjunction he identified between the pre-20th century understanding of politics, where it referred primarily to the business of the state, and the subsequent notion of politics that encompassed within its ambit everything. Though Alexander did not say so explicitly, the latter definition of politics comes close to politics as an everyday practice beyond the affairs of the state, or to the maxim, the personal is political, of the second wave feminist movement. Rather than viewing the understanding of politics as a function of the state in opposition to the understanding of politics as not limited to the state, I ask, can both be seen conjunctionally? If so, can warfare and welfare be the terms to construe politics as a function of the state as well as an activity beyond the immediate realm of the state? So my thesis in this talk is the following. An important way to analyze democracy is to understand it as a phenomenon of warfare and welfare, where both become intimately intertwined in such a way that they can work indeed they often do, as near synonyms. In many forms, this algebra of warfare and welfare is integral to electoral democracy in India as also outside. According to Oxford Dictionary, while calculus is a method of calculation, algebra investigates the relations and properties of numbers by means of general symbols and does so in a more abstract sense. I choose algebra for what I take to be its relational, symbolic, and abstract signification. So with this argument laid out, in part 1, I examine various works on the 2014 election and their understanding of democracy, most of which pertain, to use an evocative phrase from Canadian philosopher Brian Masumi, to the genre of what he calls a state-happy scholarship. In part 2, I will present my thesis, which I just outlined. One disclaimer: anthropology of politics is implicit in the talk, and it will become clearer perhaps at the end of the talk, and if you still have questions, we can discuss it in the QA. So to get to my thesis, we have to cover a lot of ground, and since it is impossible to discuss each and every work, so I have just selected what is known in sociology as case studies. So what I'm going to do here is to focus on the work of this political scientist called Paul Vallas, and then Ashutosh Varshney, and from there I will move to what I describe as ditto theory. Paul Vallas is an expert of Indian election. He has published 3 edited volumes on the parliamentary election of 1999, 2004, and 2009. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Missouri, Columbia, USA, and has been a consultant on South Asia to a number of American government committees. In 2015, he published a volume titled India's 2014 Election, a Modi-led BJP sweep. He described the result of election as historic. In his preface, Vallas stated that contributors offered in-depth national and state studies, and this is a trope in political science ways of doing both. But readers do not know what the nature of the in-depth is. From there, he quickly proceeded to note the distinctiveness of Indian democracy, quote, by the democratic standard vis-a-vis democracies in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Election in these 3 countries, we are told, failed to cope up with the basic political and social fissures, and noting that in 2013, Pakistan technically had a successful election, he has stressed how it did little to resolve the role of the military or that of jihadi groups. These are his words. He mentioned the killing of 142 people in Peshawar in December 2014 by the Taliban. It remains a mystery why Nepal stood excluded from Vallas's list of neighbors. Notably, there was no mention of the killing of over 40 Muslims in the course of electoral campaigns in Assam or the Muzaffarnagar riots in 2013, as a result of which BJP won 71 of the 80 seats in Uttar Pradesh. That is, the basic political and social fissures attributed to the neighboring countries remained invisible in the country that the book was actually about. If violence in the name of religion is inconsistent with democracy, as Vallas implied in his remark about India's distinction vis-a-vis democracy among its neighbors, he did not ask why and how did Modi kept winning one election after another in Gujarat, where over 2,000 Muslims were killed, while Modi presided over the state as its chief minister. He also did not ask how and why in a democracy, Modi, who had just justified the killings of Muslims, including a former elected MP, on the flimsy ground of his theory of action and reaction, got elected to become prime minister. Importantly, is democracy also connected to truth and justice, or is it simply an arithmetic game? Furthermore, why did Indian electorates give religious parties like BJP an absolute majority, whereas religious parties in Pakistan or Bangladesh, Jamaat-e-Islami for instance, have barely won a dozen seats, let alone become a ruling party? So let me focus on Vallas's contribution as outlined in his introduction. After the first 5-6 or pages, which are packed with data, all numbers, Vallas outlined 3 factors, all in bullet points, that led to BJP's victory. Number 1 is economy, 2 corruption, and 3rd a presidential style campaign. In a 7-line paragraph on economy, he took the onion as a symbol of high inflation. The food prices during the UPA regime, he tells readers, rose by 400%. From there, he straightaway moved to cite James Carville's remark made during Bill Clinton's election campaign. And you know what it is? It is the economy is stupid. No further explanation is offered about economy. It seems to echo the rational choice model of sociologists such as Rodney Starr. In social science, to speak of pure economy is misnomer. Economy is associated with ritual, culture, religion, and social formation. In fact, bare economy doesn't exist. It is political economy, from the perspective of which it is true that the growth had slowed in 2 years preceding election. However, the UPA had also passed many laws empowering the poor, National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of 2005 and the Food Security Act of 2013 being 2 examples. As with economy, Vallas' treatment of corruption was equally cursory. He simply mentioned that in 2011, Anna Hazare led the agitation against corruption to mobilize huge crowds. The issue is, why did the agitation against corruption, a systemic problem that cuts across all political parties, took off, and why did it receive such popularity? Vallas did not mention the mobilizational role of the RSS, nor of the media or the gurus like Baba Ramdev. Also, on what basis were people made to believe that unlike the Congress, the BJP would be free from corruption when its own former president Bangaru Lakshman was convicted in 2012 by a court on charges of corruption, and at the time of conviction he continued to sit on BJP's National Executive Board. In 2003, Dilip Singh Judio from Chhattisgarh, a minister in the Vajpayee government, was caught taking rupees 9 lakh. On camera, he unashamedly made this statement that cash in bribe was no God, but it was no less than God either. Those of you
हिंदी में ज़्यादा
क्या था?
पैसा खुदा तो नहीं पर खुदा से कम भी नहीं.
हाँ ये. Now, even after the corruption case, BJP fielded him as its candidate and he was elected to the parliament. Sukhram, an old Congress leader, caught with money under his bed and convicted on charges of corruption, later joined the BJP. My point is that an academic explanation of election has to be more than stories that parties themselves parrot or narrate. Moreover, the explanation must account for structural factors beyond the seduction of the vanishing present. The final factor, which in Vallas's account was the most important one, was this presidential style campaign led by Modi. In the campaign, readers are told Modi softened his association with right-wing Hindu slogans and instead stressed his record of economic development and governance as Chief Minister of Gujarat. However, no evidence is offered either about Modi's getting soft during the campaign or about his record of development in Gujarat. Vallas also connected the most important factor to Modi's charisma, which Rahul Gandhi lacked. However, here too, Vallas made no reference to any study of charisma and how we may understand its significance in election beyond the mere pronouncement that A is charismatic and B is not. My point is that Vallas did not refer to, let alone discuss, Max Weber, whose writings on charisma is so central. Nor did he dwell on how voters realized that Modi had charisma and how that charisma worked for voters in the age of television, Google, social media, and YouTube. So Vallas's three-pronged factors are thus no more than a bare mention, for they are analytically so disconnected from one another that they don't constitute an argument even in the minimal sense. In fact, the introduction doesn't make any argument whatsoever. As for different chapters and their contribution, they make contradictory points without the editorial realization that they might be actually contradictory. For instance, Walter Anderson in chapter 3, Vallas stated, attributed Modi's success to his appeal among the poor and the young, and that he studiously avoided Hindutva themes during the campaign and publicly rebuked those who did. However, in chapter 6, Sudha Pai and Avinash Kumar contended that key to BJP's victory was the inroads made into social bases of SP and BSP for broad Hindu vote bank. For Pai and Kumar, BJP's victory was precisely due to Modi and Amit Shah using both Hindutva and development. So much about Vallas. Now I turn to Ashutosh Varshney, a famous political scientist. He wrote this piece which is called India's Watershed Vote, Hindu Nationalism in Power, ? It too began with the percentages of various sorts, which is quite a common thing among political scientists who are influenced by American behavioralism. So for him, it was a truly distinctive election, and in his analysis, Modi's victory rested in part on his 8-month long mobilizational tour, in which he focused on, quote, economic growth, good governance, and an unflinching critique of the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, and except for, quote, occasional references, Hindu nationalism and anti-Muslim virulence were absent from the campaign. Leaving the weakness of this argument aside for the moment, suffice it to say that in making the contention that the anti-Muslim virulence was absent and that Modi's critique of Nehru-Gandhi dynasty was disconnected from Islam, Varshney, for instance, missed Modi's description of the Congress government as Delhi Sultanate. To Varshney, all social groups, Dalit, middle class, Adivasis, voted for BJP except Muslims, and this is quote, 91.5% of whom remained unwilling to put their faith in Modi or the BJP, unquote. I don't know what is the source of this data, but let's leave that aside. The sentence structure of Varshney makes it clear that the problem lies not with BJP, but with unwilling Muslims. This is more evident from his view that Muslims showed ingratitude towards BJP. He quoted some line from BJP's manifesto that promised to modernize minority education system, strengthen Waqf boards, and institute, and this is very important, quote, permanent interfaith consultative mechanism to promote harmony, unquote. He followed the quote by noting the concession BJP gave to Muslims, and despite this explicit move towards moderation by BJP and Modi, only a small share of Muslims found this conciliatory stance to be credible. As it is clear, Varshney first creates an analytical problem, the source of which he later transfers to Muslims rather than BJP to show the benevolence of the BJP, which gave concession, and the stubbornness of Muslims who is unwilling to appreciate the concession. Notably, he did not bother to investigate the contents of BJP's manifesto. So the question here is, why is it that only minority educational institutions and not also Hindu institutions need modernization? Is the call for modernization not based on the Orientalist dogma that Muslims cling to their religion and are hostile to the so-called modernity. Why is there no discourse about modernization of communities other than Muslims? It has been argued elsewhere why the academic as well as popular explanation about the backwardness of Muslims largely in terms of their religious tradition, whereas the explanation for the backwardness of other communities, including Hindus, remain removed from any religious factor. Referring to the BJP's manifesto, the promise to institute a permanent interfaith consultative mechanism to promote harmony vis-a-vis Muslims is indeed dangerous for two reasons. Number one, it takes Muslim as source of disharmony, and second, it displaces the causes of that disharmony onto faith rather than political, societal, or governmental factors. While explaining BJP's success, a key question for Varshney was how BJP would deal with Muslims. That is, in his words, to make governance in India a Hindu nationalist ideologue enterprise. And this required a change in the constitution. With this premise, he wrote, and I quote, "The last BJP government could not do it. Will the current one succeed where its predecessors failed?" Unquote. Now, the assumption behind both these sentences is fairly open-ended. While the first one can also be read as a missed opportunity, the second one likewise can imply that the BJP government should do it, but the issue is whether or not it would. Part of Varshney's article also dealt with his prophecy about new government's future. And quote, "If communal violence erupts, other parties, Muslims and non-Muslim alike, can blame the BJP and quote the Muslim vote or work to consolidate it." Unquote. Now, the deployment of the word erupt is striking. Riots just erupt. There are no agents of riots. Such formulation masks the engineered nature and political goal of riot, as it is evident in Varshney's earlier work on ethnic violence, which I have critiqued elsewhere. Here too, he identified Muslims as the cause for the occurrence of riots. And please pay attention to the quote that I'm going to give. In theory, communal attention can lie dormant if Muslims remain mute in response to Hindu nationalist assertiveness. But the problem is not so simple. The BJP rise creates strategic opportunities for two other types of political actors. The Muslim right, whose political fortune improves when communal fights are raging, enabling it to present itself as a savior of Muslims in an adverse environment, and some non-Muslim anti-BJP political parties who make the same calculation." Unquote. Surprisingly, nowhere in the article did Varshney use the term Hindu right. As for the Muslim right, which political party, one may ask, represent it? Terminological asymmetry apart, Varshney predicted about the rights under new governments as follows. Quote, "Modi is known for advocating an investment-driven model of growth, and massive riots would seriously damage prospect for both private investment and growth." End of quote. Does it not follow from this sentence that the small rights are okay because that will not hamper the investment? So beyond the logic of instrumental rationality, are rights not immoral and wrong in themselves, whether they hamper or accelerate economic growth? I comment briefly on a point more than implicit in analysis like Varshney. There is a tendency in Indian discourses that a balanced and nuanced statement must criticize both majority and minority communalism. The assumption is that both mirror each other. So let me call it ditto theory. The exact meaning of ditto in Oxford Dictionary is similar thing. In election studies, it goes something like this. And this is the formulation of ditto theory. both Hindus and Muslims use religious cards. Elsewhere, it operates variously. So in What is the Hindu Rashtra, Sitaram Yechury, an ideologue of CPM, compared M.S. Golwalkar of the RSS to Abulala Maududi, founder of Jamaat Islami, as follows: just as Hitler was a hero for Golwalkar, so was he for Maududi. End of quote. Yechury gave no citation for this dubious claim about Maududi, for whom Hitler was no hero. But this is an act of balancing. This ditto theory, as I call it, is not limited to card-holding progressives like Yechury, liberals like Ramchandra Guha, and award-winning radicals such as Arundhati Roy, who otherwise differ from each other on many other points. They converge in endorsing this ditto theory. So while Guha appealed that India's liberal must take on both Hindus and Muslim communalists, Roy argued that the rhetoric of Simi should be seen and treated in the same continuum as that of Bajrang Dal. So that is a classic example of this ditto theory. Now, what are the problems with this? The key problem is that this ditto theory flattens in a single stroke the entrenched asymmetry in political power to reach a balanced and nuanced analysis. Those of you who might be interested, there was a very famous and interesting article which is called Fuck Nuance. And it says that how this is a word that you can use about anything and say that, well, I liked your presentation, but it lacks nuance. But it means nothing. So, what is transform this monumental power of asymmetry into a textbook style simple symmetry, and who ultimately benefits from this unjust analytical operation? So what I want to say by way of summarizing this part, that the analysis of 2014 election discussed so far are too dispersed, too wandering, not to say of being inconsistent with one another, to formulate a coherent argument. The challenge before academics is how to present a set of meaningful explanation which account for the diversity and complexity of a polity that India is, and yet these explanations are not too diffuse, to mean everything and thereby nothing. Furthermore, can the analysis of 2014 election be related to theories and practices of democracy, Western and non-Western? And one of the seamy sides of Indian scholarship is that it continues to operate within the nationalist frame. There is much less engagement with what happens outside of India. Are available concepts and methods adequate to account for the kind of question 2014 election has thrown? In my reading, one key question which the 2014 election has thrown is the question about democracy itself. However, none of these studies even hinted at examining it. And this unthought as well as underthought about democracy amounts to sending politics and critical study on an extended vacation, for democracy is a byword for politics in India. Now, when we speak about politics, we speak about democracy, and when we speak about democracy, we speak about politics. But when did this equation between democracy and politics occur? Was it always there? To ask this question is the first step towards understanding 2014 election and its outcome. While there is a popular term called pseudo-secularism, pseudo-democracy as a corresponding term doesn't exist. As both secularism and democracy are terms derived from Western vocabulary, why is the first one pseudo and the second one is not? Put differently, whereas there are many writings investigating the suitability of secularism, similar literature investigating the suitability of democracy is absent. And I'm not just thinking about Rajiv Bhargav's Secularism and Its Critique. You don't have any corresponding book called Democracy and Its Critics. So what explains the publication of secularism and its critiques but the non-existence of something like democracy and its critique? That is, why is secularism considered a Western import whereas democracy is not? this unthought is actually a well thought out position reached a century ago. Christophe Jaffrelot examined Hindu political thought from the interwar period until the 1990s. And there he distinguishes between Hindu nationalism that crystallized during the interwar period from the Hindu revivalists who preceded the interwar period. Hindu revivalists supported democracy and did not consider it as an alien to India. For Hindu nationalists, such as Aurobindo, democracy was born in India and it was only making a comeback through the British. So it is something like you have stolen our treasure and now you are bringing it back. So for both Hindu revivalists and Hindu nationalists, the locus of democracy was ancient India. The absence of medieval India and Muslim tradition is a stark. Radha Kumud Mukherjee, a professor of history who was aligned with Hindu Mahasabha, saw democracy in Pali text. Congress leaders such as Purushottam Das Tandon articulated such views in the Constituent Assembly debate. Although RSS leaders like Golwalkar, Thenagri and Govindacharya, they were skeptical of democracy, they too supported it because Hindus were in a majority. Here, there are more affinities than differences between Gandhi and Hindu nationalists. And this is the conclusion of Jaffrelot, and I quote, while Hindu nationalists look at democracy as something that is not alien to India and as an element of its historical prestige, they have been especially interested in this political system because it is a convenient way to establish the domination of majority community. End of quote. Now, Jaffrelot did not discuss Nehru in his paper, but however, I think since Nehru is regarded as the architect of democratic, secular, plural India, accounting for his thought is necessary. Recently, Shefali Jha showed how the current meaning of minorities was secured by robbing it of its power in the Constituent Assembly, which framed India's constitution. With the creation of Pakistan, this very demand was dropped in the Assembly in 1949. And I think Professor Tanveer Fazal has done some work about this Constituent Assembly debate. So in July 1947, the Committee on Minorities discussed the granting of reservation in legislators to Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and the scheduled caste in proportion to their population, advocating proportional representation so as to escape the prevailing evil of democracy and the tyranny of majority, and this term goes back to Tocqueville. So one member, Qazi Karimuddin, argued that it is not based on religious ground and it applies to all minorities, political, religious, and communal. Without any sacrifice of democratic principle, he further said, representatives of communal and political minorities can be elected. And by the way, the term communal has not been always negative. Its meaning has also shifted over a period of time. Likewise, Zahur Hasan Lari, who was also a member, contended that with proportional representation, the parliament would become, and this is his words, the mirror of the national mind. The assembly, however, later passed Sardar Patel's motion, which scrapped all provision for political representation of minorities. And Nehru was elated and happy. And he congratulates Sardar Patel for bringing what he calls this historic motion to discard the evil of communitarian political representation. And here is Nehru, what he has to say. Quote, I would like you to consider this business, whether it is reservation or any other kind of safeguard for the minority, objectively. There is some point in having a safeguard where there is autocratic rule or foreign rule. In a political democracy, instead of helping the party to be safeguarded and aided, it is likely actually to turn against the community. If you seek to give safeguards to minority, you isolate it. May be you protect it to a slight extent, but at what cost? At the cost of forfeiting the inner sympathy and fellow feeling with the majority, which is dangerous. Now, of course, if it is a democracy, in the long run or in the short run, it is the will of the majority that will prevail. It is in the very nature of things in a democracy that the will of the majority will ultimately prevail. End of quote. Nehru. Nehru revealed his majoritarianism because, against a few members in the assembly who viewed democracy as an equal voice for each citizen, he advocated pure majoritarianism, saying twice in the span of a single minute that in a democracy the will of the majority will prevail. In liberal political theory, there is no permanent majority, there is no permanent minority, it is all issue based. But Nehru is not speaking of procedural minority or issue based majority. This entire statement of Nehru is in the shadow of the communitarian idea of minority and majority. So in claiming this majority, Nehru took, as did Gandhi, a Savarna assimilationist view of Hinduism, subsuming Dalits, then Shudras within it, a position which Ambedkar rejected, and he was in support of such provision. Returning to Nehru's statement in the assembly, notice the celebration of ascribing of political representation and his placement of onus on Muslims as minority to generate inner sympathy and fellow feeling with the majority. So it is the duty of the minority itself to generate that feeling so that you are liked by the majority. This logic resembles exactly that of the RSS, which holds that minorities need the majority's goodwill. So sympathy is replaced with goodwill. Nothing illustrates better the transference of the political from constitution to the realm of majoritarian sympathy than the absence of secular in the constitution until the mid-70s. Academics celebrating secular Nehru are yet to explain why he did not attempt to place secular in the constitution and why it was done only in mid-70s, long after his death. Similarly, with Nehru as prime minister, how did the Holocaust in Jammu, where in one estimate over 2 lakh were massacred in October 1947, and the killing of over 50,000 in Hyderabad in 1948 took place? And this is all under Nehru's dispensation. So the aim of the discussion so far was to show that enthusiasm behind democracy is because not because of its innate virtue, but because it empowers a particular community. This enthusiasm is not limited to Hindu nationalists, whom scholars like Nirja Jayal or Sudipto Kaviraj or Sunil Khilnani or Shalmaya Ram or even Muklika Banerjee, Amar Sen and others describe as exclusivists pitted against the so-called plural, secular and inclusive vision of Nehru, Gandhi and the Congress. The opponents of Hindu nationalism too share it, though differently. The root of this, and this is another term that I use, ethnic democracy. The root of this ethnic democracy is traceable to the very birth of India as a nation state. Based on historical, legal and ethnographic research on conversion in Tamil Nadu, anthropologist Nathaniel Loberts shows how a prior notion of Hindu nation permeates the Supreme Court judgments, and that such a notion of nation was not just Savarkar's understanding but also Gandhi's. According to Patrick Wolf, European Orientalism and Indian nationalism, they colluded together to endorse the communist principle that Muslims' decline was synonymous with Hindu Renaissance, thereby inscribing Muslims as the author of Indian nationalism. Now, with Pakistan's creation, and Sardar Patel called it cutting off the diseased limb. So you have to think about India being imagined as a human organism, and for this human organism to remain healthy, the diseased parts has to be cut off. And this is how he described the creation of Pakistan. Now, with the cutting off the diseased limb, the enemy other was simultaneously without and within Indian nationalism, itself elevated to a divine pedestal. In the early 20th century, the terrorist turned mystic Aurobindo answered the question, what is nationalism, as follows, and I quote, "Nationalism is not a mere political program. Nationalism is a religion that has come from God. Nationalism is a creed which you shall have to live. End of quote. Well over a century after Aurobindo Baba Ramdev re-articulated it, and I quote, "There is no God greater than the nation. National interest is above everything. Nation God is the greatest God. Those who do not love the soil, culture, civilization, and people of the nation." Now, once you include soil, culture, civilization, nothing is left outside, right? They have no right to stay in this country. End of quote. As Marino's biography of him illustrates, Modi's worldview squarely falls within this universe. And built into this matrix, comprising religion, culture, national interest, democracy, nation, and a recast non-traditional Hinduism is an imagined inimical other, which Ramdev threatened to expel, of course by force, if necessary. So soon after the election result, Modi acknowledged this enmity, although only by denying it. So just after the conclusion of election, he said, "There is no enmity in democracy, but there is competition." This denial was needed precisely because the entire electoral campaign exemplified this politics of enmity. Now, one can go to document one example after another. I have just taken two. And the key thing is, when Modi was not still a chief minister of Gujarat, he participated just after 9/11 in a television debate where he hailed the media for speaking the truth when it used the phrase Islamic terrorism. And Modi opined that terrorism was innate to Islam. In his view, the whole world has been witnessing terrorism for the last 1400 years. That is from the time of Prophet Muhammad. Modi saw the post 9/11 era as a battle between humanity on the one hand and terrorism on the other. The humanity Modi spoke of did not exist as a prior idea. Instead, it was manufactured through the disingenuous discourse on terrorism that his party put on international stage. And I quote here, and this is from that television debate. "See, because of India's initiative in the United Nations, meeting twice, we have made terrorism an issue. Due to this, we have succeeded in dividing the country into two camps, those who are against terrorism and those who are in support of terrorism. I think that the recent incident in America, 9/11, will intensify this division. The world is about to be divided into two parts, those who are in favor of humanity and those who are against humanity." End of quote. You can see this language of dualism which was also reflected in Bush and others. So this logic, positioning and argumentation in this quote from Modi entail a fresh conceptualization of politics from the dominant conception of it in the language of welfare alone. Those of you who have read sociology and anthropologist would remember that in an anthropological sense, Indian state was described as Mai Baap, mother and father. This is anthropological understanding of. Now this view is stemmed from the language of care. The state takes care of the citizen in the same way parents take care of their children. That many parents also inflict violence on their children was sidelined to paint the image of the state as provider of welfare. Indian textbook on political science have highlighted only the welfarist view of politics. So for example, and some of you who might be preparing for some competitive exams, and this is from IGNOU textbook, it quotes David Easton and Bernard Crick to stress the welfarist definition of politics, which is politics pertains to the manner in which power, wealth, and resources are distributed in society. It is such a simple, straightforward thing. Now, my point is not that there is no welfare. What I'm saying is that one has to take into account also the warfare dimension of politics. And this welfare definition of politics is not sufficient. So at the intersection of national and international politics, the 2014 election demonstrated the combination of welfare with warfare. I use warfare as a shorthand for the dualistic politics which constructs a sharp fence between us friends and them enemy. In the concept of the political, Carl Schmitt viewed the political as instituting the distinction between friend and enemy embodied in the figure of the others, the strangers, something different and alien. And of course, he was the philosopher, legal theorist of fascism. In Carl Schmitt's formulation, while the enemy is outside, that is another state, and this is quote, every state provides some kind of formula for the declaration of an internal enemy. He went on to observe that the meanings of terms like state, society, republic, class, sovereignty, economic planning, and so on acquired signification not by themselves, but primarily in relation to the friend-enemy distinction. The political by no means meant, Schmitt clarified, party politics in a conventional sense. The figure of the enemy exists beyond differences among political parties. In recent history, no leader enacted this politics of friend-enemy the way Modi did. The enemy was frequently Muslim as the friend was Hindu. As pointed out earlier, the enemy was outside as much as inside. And this is before him becoming Prime Minister. I think I don't need to spend time. These quotes are well known. Now, such speeches enabled Modi to win one election after another. They were not mere rhetoric. A young woman sitting in the front row and listening to Modi screamed, and I quote, "Kill the Muslim motherfuckers," end of quote. It is fair to say that many non-BJP parties did not overtly endorse Modi's politics. However, they did not oppose it by launching a counter-mobilization. All of them, including the left parties, nurtured the discourse of terrorist enemy identified with Islam. Thus, the difference between the Congress and BJP was not about the passage of new law to fight terrorism, which, like Muslim, was both inside and outside. It was about the ways to fight it. In Schmitt's terms, the Congress was not an enemy of BJP. It was at best, and this is Carl Schmitt's term, a debating adversary. Post 9/11, the figure of the enemy terrorist remained constant while the party in power has changed. In 2014 election, too, politics as enmity continued. So let me conclude. So this politics of enmity, and this is another term that I want to bring to focus, which is the dog whistle politics. And we can talk about it later. But when Rahul Gandhi is described as Shahzada and Congress government is described as Delhi Sultanate, this is a perfect example of dog whistle politics. It is not that Hindi language has a word called Yuvraj. So you have a choice to call Rahul Gandhi Yuvraj, but why do you call Shahzada? So this is to render a symmetry or consonance between a figure and a particular religious tradition. And that is the classic example of dog whistle politics. So let me conclude by clarifying my hyphenated use of warfare, welfare phrase and its link with neoliberalism. Whereas warfare is not opposed to welfare. If welfare aims to ensure social security, warfare does the same for national security. Herbert Marcuse hinted at the link between the need for an enemy and development. He critiqued President Johnson's 1960 plan for what was called Greater Society in the US, stating how the plan would be like a welfare state prepared to turn into a warfare state. So the algebra of warfare welfare that I enunciate acquired new modalities with the end of the Cold War and the subsequent hot war on terrorism. With neoliberalism as its ideology, the New World Order adopted a variety of practices such as privatization, structural adjustment, liberalization, and sheer triumph of the market. In its various forms, neoliberalization inaugurated a massive change in reorganization of the states, politics, and societies worldwide. Globalization was thus neither the withdrawal of the state nor its diminishing role, for policing, securitization, and militarization have only increased. Rather, it was the reconfiguration of the state. The idiom of the free market became the master language applied to nearly every domain. passengers became customers. Does the Indian Railway use still the term passenger, or it is customers now? So in Australia, in Britain, they have changed it into customers. In Monash University, when I was teaching, if you, as a PhD student, if you deposited your fees online, then you will get an automatic message saying, thank you, client, for depositing your fee. So the students became client. Passengers became customers. It is important to stress the use of market and media infused terms in BJP's manifesto. BJP's manifesto promises to revive brand India. So the point is, so the formulation is that this brand always existed, you just need to revive it. But this idea of calling a nation state as brand itself is connected to this logic, and some of you might recall that India was dubbed as brand, and then Times Now would have a debate whether brand Modi is ahead of brand Rahul or brand Gandhi, which is something new in the 50s and 60s. You don't see this. So the move to see India as a brand was itself a global phenomenon. In politics, this transformation led to projecting of politicians as salesmen and citizens as buyers. Issues of civic participation, contestation over what the common good is, all became hostage to the calculus or the mammon. I have coined the term designer democracy to capture this new phase as well as phenomenon of politics. 2-3 minutes more?
Yeah.
So this is the concluding part. The BJP victory in 2014 election was surely defining, but the full meaning of that victory can properly be understood not in the register of superficial percentages of voters turnout or increase in number of seats by this or that party presented in colorful diagrams, but in relation to a theoretically inscribed historical, political, neoliberal cultural configuration I have argued for, and in terms of cost and visions of life, human and non-human alike. In short, life as essentially itself, the destination of which is death or killing. This is what I mean by democracy as algebra of warfare and welfare. I just need 1 minute to explain this. So, as an anthropologist, this is a scene of a polling booth in Melbourne, Australia. So, I was curious that, what election actually looks like. So, I went there and I talked to these people. These were activists of a party called Palmer United Party. Palmer is one filthy billionaire of Australia who floated this party, and he didn't have any following and so on. So this woman I spoke to, she was distributing these leaflets, and I end up talking to her and I asked her, like, what does Palmer United Party stand for? And she draws a blank. And then I ask one question after another. And then I ask her, like, then why do you campaign for this this candidate? It turns out that actually she is not an Australian citizen even. She is a British tourist who is touring Australia. She was short of money, and Palmer was giving probably $300 per day, which she would have earned probably in a week's time. So she's just simply started distributing this, and this is the exact example of the mammon display in politics. And this is in 2013, Tony Abbott won the election, and I was curious, like, how the newspapers described him becoming prime minister. The Age, which is the main newspaper of Melbourne, it put on the cover page, Australia under new management. And this is Tony Abbott's own self-description also after becoming prime minister. So this is what I mean, the example of new kind of politics under neoliberalism. So I think that is where I will stop.